Story 1. The Podcast. I loaded up the van with my 3 friends as we prepared ourselves for the greatest episode yet. We hosted a true crime podcast that was beginning to pick up viewers all around the world. At the rate at which we were growing, we might not even need to finish college. We started off as a comedy podcast, but after an episode of talking about various conspiracies and darker material like serial killers, our views went through the roof. So obviously, we made the transition over the next week or so. We added a different spin to our podcast, however. Unlike most podcasters going over similar content, we had a more direct approach. We would listen to police scanners and pick out cases involving murder and gather our evidence after the police were done. This way we could present our episodes before the media was able to give off their spin. This may or may not have been legal, but we didn't have any issues before, and we were pretty stealthy in our work. Our next episode was going to be huge for us. We had heard one of the scanners talk about several bodies being found at an old factory off on the other side of the state. From what we could find online, the media had yet to be involved. What we understood on the police scanner and radio transmissions we had intercepted, this looked like the work of some kind of cult. This particular case was still ongoing due to lack of leads, but this didn't stop us wanting to investigate. It was a holiday weekend, so we had plenty of time to pop in, take some pictures, and get out of there before the police even knew we were there. This obviously ran some risks, but none that we weren't willing to take. After loading up the van with our gear, I jumped in the passenger seat while Nick started up the van. Our videographer Ethan and Jessica, our sound technician, jumped in the back as we excitedly left the parking lot and onto the highway. The crime scene was 2 hours away, which wasn't too bad in comparison to the other places we had driven to. Our research of the factory was that it was some kind of lumber mill and processing plant, though no longer in operation. The factory began dying out several decades ago, which caused people to move away, but some residents still remained. The town was so small that we couldn't find a hotel to house us, so we resorted into bringing a few tents and staying in the nearby woods. We had done this before, and the audience loved us recapping our investigations around the campfire, although it slightly made it more difficult to film the podcast, but we didn't care. The reports came in over the last couple of days, meaning that this case was relatively fresh, and that it was only a matter of time before the media got a hold of it. From what we understood, several bodies had been found discarded inside, mostly those of homeless drug addicts that had taken shelter in the abandoned facility. We had done a fair amount of research, and we all had varying ideas of who or what was behind this. Nick thought that this was the work of a serial killer, some twisted person taking advantage of the defenseless homeless, trying to find shelter. Jessica thought that these were just overdoses, since none of the radio reports mentioned any conditions of the bodies. Ethan thought perhaps this was the dumping ground for the mob, those that owed debts or had simply crossed the wrong people. For myself, I thought that something was different. Something about this ongoing case felt wrong, at least comparison to the others that we'd covered. Small towns typically don't have a lot of homeless, yet they found half a dozen bodies in this building. Something didn't seem right, but that was just me. We pulled into the town of Quincy, which housed the now abandoned factory, and stopped at the only convenience store for a few last-minute supplies. The town was small, but had a healthy amount of people living there for its size. Ethan and Jessica stayed in the van to no doubtly take advantage of being alone, while Nick and I bought some last-minute items. We grabbed our few items and went to the counter to check out. An old man wearing flannel stood at the counter. His eyes glared at us as if he disapproved of our youth. The man tallied our total and asked, "What brings y'all to Quincy?" he said, while ringing up our stuff. "Oh, we're just driving through. Had to pick up a few things," Nick said. "That's probably for the best," he said, while looking at us and giving us a toothy grin. "Lots of weird stuff going on lately." Nick and I glanced at each other, trying not to smile. "Weird? What do you mean? Like the weather or something?" I said, playing dumb. Whenever we went to do an investigation, we made an effort not to leave an impression on anyone to avoid being caught. but at the same time, we couldn't pass up an opportunity to get some free insight to a loose-lipped local. The weather's always weird here. Nah, I'm talking about the new curfew put in place. The mayor's trying to take away our freedoms. I didn't know what was more surprising, this place having a mayor, or hearing about the curfew. Yeah, had a few people go missing, and now we can't be out after dark. I think the government's behind it. Nick and I tread carefully, as to not pry too much so as not to come off as suspicious, but this man was feeding us valuable information we didn't know about. We only knew about the bodies in the factory, but nothing about the missing people nor the curfew. That does sound bad. What time is the curfew? I said, legitimately curious. The man looked at his watch. It's around 7 or so, or whenever it gets dark, whichever comes first. That was quite bizarre. We paid for our items and left, unsure if the information the man gave us was real or not, but we made our way over to the factory, on the other side of town. A chain-linked fence surrounded the large empty building that nestled up against the woods. Caution tape covered what was once the entrance, and a heavy-duty lock set at the entrance gate. We'd planned for this. A dirt road was not too far from the factory that led off into the woods. We drove in on the gravel road, looking for a nice little area to conceal ourselves and our van. About a half a mile in, we found a small clearing that was just far enough in off the dirt road that looked suitable to conceal our operation. We parked, unloaded our stuff, set up camp, and placed a dark tarp over the van to add more concealment to our campsite. We waited for darkness to fall before we made our way over to the factory, which was going to take a couple of hours. In the meantime, we sat around our campsite and prepped our gear. Ethan prepped his camera, and Jessica inspected the several microphones to make sure they had enough batteries. Nick and I went over what we wanted to cover in regards to content. We wanted to inspect the building, go over our possible theories, and try to conduct our own investigation. The sun seemed to linger as we all anticipated our illegal nightly activities in the abandoned factory. We debated on having a campfire, but we went against it. We sat in our camp chairs and went over our theories again to kill the time. I heard that before the bodies were found, that many people claimed that this place was haunted by ghosts that had died from accidents from inside, Ethan said, smiling, trying to get a rise out of us. Unfortunately for him, we were all veteran horror junkies, so stories of haunted buildings were going to have little effect on us. Oh please, most places we've investigated have been haunted and we've never caught any evidence, Jessica said, while rolling her eyes. Plus, ghosts are the least of our worries. I'm worried about the hobos still living inside. Jessica had brought up a valid point, but this didn't dissuade us. We had power in numbers, and if we did come across any homeless, they were typically too drugged out of their minds to really be an issue. Ethan was staring at the ground. I could tell he was still conflicted about what the store clerk had said to us earlier that day. I wanted to mention the curfew to the group, but I felt that would have hindered our investigation if everyone knew. Night eventually came, and we carried our gear on the dirt road and made our way over to the factory. The woods combined with the darkness created an added element of coverage from prying eyes, but it also made me feel uneasy. I didn't believe in the paranormal, nor superstition, but the sensation I was feeling was beyond logic. Thankfully, our walk was relatively short, and we exited the woods to find the factory, looming off in the distance. Thankfully, the building was old enough that it didn't have any exterior lights around the perimeter, making our unauthorized entry all the more easier. We marched our way over to the rear of the fence line and prepared to cut the fence, but we were surprised that a hole had already existed. Easy enough, Nick said. The hole was large enough that we barely had to duck, but we entered not thinking of the potential dangers that awaited inside. The courtyard of the factory had large bundles of old rotting wood and rusted machinery. Surprisingly enough, none of the doors or windows were boarded up, but caution tape was placed over the main entrances of the factory to dissuade people like us from entering. We simply pushed it aside as we walked into the factory. On the main level, dirt and leaves covered most of the floor, as well as trash from vagrants once calling this place home. Jessica handed us our mics, and we clipped them onto our shirts, and Ethan began filming. We shined our flashlights all around to begin our investigation. Nick and I began to narrate as we explored the first floor, looking for the crime scene. Nothing of note stood out to us, but this building had several floors that we had to investigate, so we were not discouraged. On the main floor, there were still some rooms that were locked, so they had to remain unexplored. We eventually found a stairwell that went both up and down. Due to our filming materials, we had to stick together. In the stairwell, we saw more caution tape covering the stairs going up, so naturally the choice was obvious. We went to the second floor and instantly found the crime scene. This was a goldmine for us. The floor was less dirty, as it was on the first floor, but still had random garbage strewn about. Various words and symbols were written in a dark liquid that we figured had to be blood. This had to be it. We were astonished. The bodies that were once here had been removed, but thick pools of blood still remained. Ethan was filming the walls, while Nick followed closely behind, giving his theories. The walls must have been written on by some kind of cult group. The symbols are unknown, but we will do research on them once we get back. We investigated the second floor, finding new pieces of evidence as we went along, but my ears pricked up when I heard a low rumble, coming from outside. "Shh," I whispered, as I turned off my flashlight. "Do you guys hear that?" The team quickly quieted down and turned off their lights as we all rushed to the front of the building and looked outside. A pair of old yellow headlights beamed in our direction as a small truck pulled up to the factory gates. "Who could this be? Security?" Jessica whispered. No one answered as the truck parked and a man got out and unlocked the gate. Nick and I both knew that this man was breaking curfew and that he shouldn't be here, but we sat quietly as we saw him drive in and park at the entrance. To our horror, we could see several large bags in the back of his truck. They were wrapped up with chains and locks. Ethan continued filming as we silently watched the man as he grabbed one of the several heavy bags and began to drag it inside the factory. We moved from the window and listened as the man shuffled on the main floor. Ethan and I moved to the stairwell and heard the man dragging the bag past and stopped. We slowly peered our heads out and saw that he was stopped outside a room that was locked. A chain wrapped around the double door handles and seemed to be locked with another heavy-duty lock. He then dropped the bag, unlocked the door with one of several keys, and entered inside, while continuing to drag the bag. He quickly exited, and we hid back into the stairwell as the man repeated this process several times until his truck bed was empty. Once he finished disposing of the ominous bags, he locked the room again and went back outside into his truck and drove off. We went back up to the second floor and met with Nick and Jessica. We were all astonished at what we had found. Was this guy connected to the bodies that were only found just a few days ago? Or was he simply just dumping some garbage at an abandoned factory? We made sure the man was gone before going back down to the main floor. We showed everyone the room that was locked in which the man had dumped the bags, but he had relocked it before leaving. The chain was too thick, but the lock that held it together looked quite old. Luckily, we still had our bolt cutters from earlier and clipped the lock and removed the chains. We weren't quite sure what to expect when we opened the doors, but we were surprised to see that the room was empty of the bags. There was an old desk and some filing cabinets in the corner of the room, but no bags. What we did find, however, was an ominous-looking hole in the middle of the room. It was about 3 feet in diameter, with drag marks leading to it. The bags were surely dumped into this hole, but where did it lead to? We all peered inside to hopefully find an explanation, but the hole was too deep and too dark for us to see anything. "This obviously leads to the basement," Nick said, while still glancing inside. "What should we do?" We were there to investigate, but something about this event seemed off. I began to feel dread emanating from this hole. Despair and pain seemed to assault my mind the longer I glanced into it. "I think we should leave and show the police what we saw and just let them deal with it," Jessica said. I remained silent, although I agreed. Nick and Ethan turned quickly to Jessica with surprised looks on their faces. "Are you kidding? This is a gold mine. We have to check this out," Ethan said. "Can you imagine the episode numbers we'd have on this if we actually found bodies?" Nick said in affirmation. Jessica reluctantly agreed, and we all made our way over to the stairwell. But this time, we descended the stairs. Our flashlights provided very little light, and the temperature began to get cooler the further down we went. The old metal stairs creaked and groaned under our collective weight, and we eventually reached the bottom. The basement smelled of a mixture of mildew and rotting food. The floor plan was relatively open, with random bits of junk and machinery filling random spaces. The room on the main floor with a hole in it was pretty far back into the building, so we'd have to go pretty deep in to reach the bags. We were being pretty careless, as the thought of someone being down here had slipped our minds. Aside from the man from earlier, we hadn't seen nor heard anyone this whole time, but that changed the further in we went. Nick stopped and raised his hand, causing us to silence our conversations and stop behind him. He shined his light ahead of us a good ways, but it only reached a concrete support pillar. We waited there for a few seconds before Ethan spoke up. "What is it?" he whispered. Nick kept his focus ahead while responding hesitantly. I thought I saw something." He scanned his light around in hopes of seeing something to justify this, but there was nothing. Before we started walking again, a quiet voice from within the darkness spoke. "Help me." The voice seemed feminine, but it was hard to tell from such a distance. We all looked at each other, unsure of what to do, but we ended up walking in the direction of the voice. Before we reached whoever was talking to us, we saw the outlines of several bags stacked on top of each other. One of them had spilled open, and its contents had spilled out. Before we could inspect the bags, the voice spoke again, but this time it was much closer. This time, instead of a cry for help, the person said something slightly strange. "Come here. I want to show you something." This request halted our progress. What a strange thing to say to someone in a dark basement in an abandoned factory. Jessica stopped and whispered. "Something's off," she exclaimed, as she backpedaled away from the voice. Nick stopped and began shining his flashlight again, this time landing on a figure in the corner of the basement. Jessica had begun walking back to the stairs, while the three of us looked intently as the figure began to slowly turn. The figure was hairy, and as it turned we were able to see its face. It confused us, as it looked as if it had a mask of bone on. Its eyes were hollow, and its mouth was dripping a dark liquid with red teeth within it. One of the bags was within arm's reach of the creature. It was eating whatever was inside. This shocking sight had frightened all of us, and we immediately turned and ran. It was such a flurry of screams and movement that I was unsure of what screams were from us and what was that of the creature. I sprinted up the stairs with Jessica in front of me, and we ran out of the stairwell, through the factory, and out into the courtyard. We made it out of the factory, and the group briefly reunited before heading back into the woods. I made sure to glance back to make sure whatever that thing wasn't following us. We found the trail that led to our campsite, and speed-walked back. We had seen enough. The further we walked from that building, the better. Once we got back to the campsite, we all collapsed in our chairs from both exhaustion and fright. "That was crazy. What was that thing?" Ethan inquired. "I don't know, but it didn't look human," Jessica followed up. "But it had to have been. It spoke to us." Jessica and Ethan continued speaking, and I glanced over to find Nick, but he was gone. "Hey guys, did you see Nick at all? Did he make it out with us?" I said, legitimately concerned. "Yeah, he was behind me when we went up the stairs, but I don't remember seeing him after that." "Maybe he's using the bathroom," Jessica said. We all shined our flashlights around and yelled Nick's name, just loud enough not to draw unwanted attention our way. I was beginning to get worried and started walking back down the dirt road when I saw a figure at the end of my flashlight. "Nick?" I inquired. "Are you okay?" The outline was clearly Nick, but he wasn't responding. I could see his clothes were a bit worse for wear and he had a cut on his forehead, but other than that, he seemed to be in one piece. "Buddy, what's wrong? Come over here and let's get you bandaged up." He continued to stare at me, unresponsive to the things I just said to him. He then did something that made me not only worry about his health, but put me on edge. He then turned his head as if he was confused, as if he had never met me before. He began to convulse slightly. "Nick, what's wrong, dude? What are you doing?" We stood there silently as he slowly took an unnatural step towards me. My light was not able to reach him as he was too far away. Although this looked like my friend, I was beginning to think that this was someone else entirely. I then heard a shriek from behind me, and I quickly turned away for only a moment before turning back. Nick was gone. He must have darted off into the woods in the split second I looked away. I wanted to call out to him, but I just went back to the campsite to leave. I saw Ethan and Jessica hugging and laughing. "What's going on? Why were you screaming?" I demanded. "Oh, Jessica found a spider crawling on her leg," Ethan said playfully. "How was your search for Nick?" I remained silent. I didn't know how to respond. While I was sitting, waiting on words to conjure to convince them that we needed to leave without Nick, Jessica stood up. "I need to pee," she declared. She started walking away when I blurted out, "Don't," I said starkly. That was all I could think of. She shot me a weird glance. "Why not?" she inquired. I paused briefly before sharing my experience I just had. "I think something took Nick and tried to lure me off into the woods with him." "Wait, you saw Nick?" Ethan said. "Yeah, he was acting weird and wouldn't come any closer." "Are you sure he just wasn't messing with you?" Ethan replied. Before I could speak, Nick spoke from within the darkness, just off into the woods. "I'm here," he said somberly. We all turned to see him, just barely in view of our flashlights. I had a much better look at him, although it was still hard to see. He sounded like Nick, but his frame said otherwise. He was an average height, but he had now grown at least a foot in a small span of time that he was missing. His arms were long, and his skin seemed pale and stretched. His head still hung off to the side, and his mouth was open agape. "You okay, buddy?" Ethan said. Nick's eyes reflected the beam of the flashlight on his now black pupils. "We should go back to the factory. I have something I want to show you," Nick said. His mouth stayed open but didn't move when he spoke. The feeling of dread began to emanate in my core, that same feeling I felt while staring into that hole. I could tell everyone felt the same. All of our eyes widened, as our survival instincts were now on overdrive. This Nick, our once good friend, was being impersonated by some wretched creature. It sounded like him, but wasn't fully able to replicate his appearance, at least not yet. I then bolted to the van and quickly removed the tarp as Jessica and Ethan followed behind me. I entered the van as Jessica entered the passenger seat, and I started the engine. The headlights landed on Ethan as the creature pounced on him quickly. The monster wasted no time in dispatching Ethan, as there was nothing he could do. I put the van in reverse and punched it out of there as we could hear the screams of the creature procuring its next meal. Jessica began to sob quietly, as we had narrowly escaped this thing. I was filled with adrenaline, and the only thought that I could think of was to drive to the town's police station in hopes for help. We drove down the dirt road, past the factory and back into town. As you can imagine, the streets were empty. With a town this small, it didn't take us long to find the police station. We pulled in and ran inside. A single policeman manned the office when we entered. We had told him what had happened at the factory and what we experienced off into the woods. He was just as flustered as we were, and he didn't know what to do with the information we had just given him. Jessica was still crying, but was trying her best to hold it together. "Oh boy, let me call the sheriff and we'll get this figured out," he said, in an uneasy manner. We'd finally felt safe. Our terrible night of misadventure and horror was now closing to its end. After 15 minutes of waiting and starting to calm down, a small truck pulled up to the office. A man came inside and smiled at us as I slowly began to recognize him from earlier. "Deputy tells me you had quite the experience over at the abandoned factory," he said, with a knowing grin. I paused, as I slowly remembered where I had seen him from. It was the man from earlier, who was dragging the bodies inside that hole. "Why don't we go take a look at that factory and see what we can find," he said, while pulling out his pistol and forcing us outside.